Center used game theory, which was something I was not familiar with up until this point, which is a simulation program, and he had generated 14 different hypotheses of possible Civil War outcomes based on inputting minimal factors such as geography and weaponry. I also noticed military specialists were extolling the benefits of robotics and long-distance surveillance and weaponry. To me, they're computer models void of all race, ethnicity, and gender markers, or using very crude racializations and abstractions of people looked more like video game theory. The danger of simulation distance warfare is that it deliberately blurs the distinction between the real and the virtual, thereby obfuscating accountability. For Baudrillard, the danger lies at the moment that the simulation moves from imitation or being a mimetic copy and becomes its own truth by surpassing the real and becoming the hyperreal. In this distanciation and abstraction of war, promises are made by military technology industries, and the future of warfare is projected as bloodless, smarter, and cleaner due to the superiority of digital abilities. So the goal with this panel was to interrogate these technologies that have created another universe of simulation, simulacra, and the hyperreal from a multidisciplinary perspective. In my talk, I will use case studies from my year-long ethnographic fieldwork in Afghanistan to bring people back into the equation and the picture. Specifically, I will address the racialized and gendered dimensions of war and its ramifications on the local population generally, as well as the people who report on war, especially local fixers, translators, and journalists who are on the front lines. Contrary to popular understanding, Afghanistan is a very multi-ethnic, multi-racial, and multi-religious place. Over 30 years of ethnic, racial, tribal, gender, and class violence, the media, after over 30 years of all these types of violence, the media is providing a semblance of justice, debate, and healing. In my dissertation, I argue that the media in Afghanistan has the potential to underwrite democracy, national integration, and peace. The international donor community, along with Western and transnational media corporations such as BBC, Internews, Voice of America, USAID, and UNESCO, have invested heavily in Afghanistan's media sector to support both democratic sensibilities, or what some people call winning hearts and minds. This specifically is a telecommunication tower built by USAID, which is the United States' main developmental arm, and protected by a US soldier. It enables TV, radio broadcasting, and mobile phone signals. Other non-official sources of funding for the media include arms and/or opium revenues. In fact, a number of media owners are warlords. Even the Taliban have long moved past their unpopular Sharia radio into all kinds of other media. Whereas the Taliban media and other niche or sectarian media are polarizing and divisive, the resultant transnational, that is Afghan and foreign co-productions, have a progressive multicultural approach to nation building. They produce media messages aimed at uniting the nation by promoting human rights awareness, diversity, and plurality. They also actively promote freedom of the press and speech against conservative forces in Afghanistan. However, at the same time, various other branches of the international community create, promote, and perpetuate racism and sexism. Post 9/11, Afghan people were stereotyped in the mainstream Western media and popular culture. In order to justify the American military assault on the Taliban, all Afghan women became extreme victims of backwards, misogynist, villainous Afghan men. Afghan culture was interpolated as static, unchanging, and bound by archaic, problematic traditions. Based on earlier colonial iconographies, this trope simultaneously creates what's been called a rape and rescue fantasy in regards to racialized women and a death chant for savage and barbaric racialized men, the most iconic being Osama and Saddam. This is a common strategy with a long history that has moved into new technologies recently. Video games are predicated on these racist tropes with its visual culture. Of course, in this abstraction and distantiation, the line between video games and real war is not surprisingly being erased. Hypermasculinity, hyperreality, and protectionism overlap to serve the overlapping interests of the culture and military technology industries. These are just a few examples, which I don't really have the time to explain, but I can just briefly talk about. The first one is a video game called Red River, which speculates that Afghanistan becomes an extremist Islamist state and that the US has to invade it yet again because there's fear of it moving across the river to Tajikistan and other post-Soviet republics. And then the last one is about a video game based on the film, or the remake of the film, Red Dawn, and they talk about the 25 most racist tweets about Asian people that this video game has incited in people. So that's just an example of this strategy of justifying war. The US military has also systematically targeted journalists in war zones. US missile strikes on media personnel in the 2003 Iraq invasion killed a reporter from Al Jazeera and cameramen from Reuters and several local TV stations in Baghdad. In Afghanistan, during the US launching of Operation Anaconda and Operation Enduring Freedom post 9/11, the US military also bombed the Al Jazeera Kabul office along with at least 3 different local news agencies. The larger structures of racism and sexism are also embedded in the inequities and disparities that exist in the international news production chain. During my field work in Afghanistan, I witnessed the power dynamics and hierarchies that favor international correspondents and embedded journalists and place local fixers, translators, camera people, and journalists in grave danger. Reporters on the front lines face an onslaught of danger from international military, insurgents, and mercenaries. They are targeted in their hotels, studios, and in the field. When danger strikes such as kidnappings and attacks, the international correspondents are usually negotiated for and or rescued while the locals are left behind, deemed as disposable and dispensable. I will briefly describe 3 cases from my research. The picture that the man is holding is Ajmal Naqshbandi. He was a fixer and translator for an Italian journalist. When they were captured by the Taliban, the Italian journalist and him, the Italian journalist was negotiated for. There was a contract or an agreement between the international community, specifically different Italian organizations and the Afghan government, to release 5 Taliban prisoners. And so they released the Italian journalist, and Naqshbandi was left behind and later very brutally and on film beheaded by the Taliban. 2 of the people I came to know through my research are Razak Mamoon and Sultan Munadi. This is Mamoon, the host of a television news show. He's a very well-respected journalist in Afghanistan. Last year, he was the victim of an acid attack by Iranian government agents. While I was there, another journalist friend, Sultan Munadi, who you see in this picture, was killed by ISAF, which is the International Security Armed Forces. He was working as a fixer, translator for a New York Times reporter when they were captured by the Taliban. The British military, the New York Times reporter had dual American-British citizenship. So the British military rescued the New York Times reporter in a daring midnight rescue. And in the process, they shot and killed Munadi, even though he was screaming, journalist, when speaking in English, they shot and killed him. Needless to say, there's, journalists are seen as heroes in Afghanistan. There was massive protests. There's a very active protest culture in Afghanistan. For weeks after these incidences happened, not just yet. Local journalists play a vital role in the international news production chain. They have the cultural access and understanding, including language skills and local ties that enable them to report in many regions that foreign correspondents could not traverse alone. Their cultural access also frees them from embedded journalism and reliance on prepackaged news. Often without ties to agenda-setting institutions, they uncover international local connections and cover-ups. They are also more likely to get to the front lines to show the realities and atrocities of war at its most gruesome. The next set of images are from a trip I went on in a US military Chinook helicopter. Those are the really long double ones. I, along with a group of journalists, were invited on Ambassador Eikenberry's diplomatic mission after an incident that resulted in civilian casualties. So these are just all the different gunners. On this trip, I observed some of the constraints Afghan media makers face, but also the larger problems of embedded journalism. This is our DoD media officer, Department of Defense media officer, who was directing our every movement. The focus was supposed to be on Eikenberry's conciliatory gestures. There were no opportunities to speak or meet the survivors. These two television reporters were extremely uneasy about being embedded with U.S. soldiers. And in fact, I had to talk, they didn't know much English, I had to talk with the soldiers to get them vests and helmets as well. Yet, despite the restrictions, Afghan journalists managed to show a variety of newsreel violence, and a lot of it. There's over 33 different broadcast stations in Afghanistan, so it's a very lively media landscape there. In the US, due to the stratified nature of capitalism, news-based televisual violence is censored by the overlapping interests of the advertising industry, television executives, and the government. As seasoned anti-war activists know, showing the realities of war and war-related violence is a very effective means of perhaps not achieving peace, but at least coalescing public opinion and the tide of change against it. So in conclusion, these are just a few of the many media-related crimes and murders. Reporters Without Borders, the Committee to Protect Journalists, and NAI, which is an Afghan-based journalist watchdog group supported by Internews and USAID, have been documenting rising statistics and acts of violence and murders perpetuated against media makers, yet no arrests are made and no one is prosecuted. ISAF, NATO, and American forces tried to protect the telecommunication towers from the Taliban by either placing them within the compound walls of their military bases or having soldiers guard them. But it is time to also protect the flesh and blood people who run the one institution with the most democratic potential to protect people. Media owners, the Afghan government, and the international community must be held accountable for the safety of local journalists. This isn't just a problem of personal safety, but the future of independent media in Afghanistan depends on it. Currently, self-censorship is becoming more and more prevalent amongst media makers. Over the last decade, it has taken a Foucauldian turn to self-discipline as a means of appeasing the hegemonic powers of elites. Once the venues for mass communication and mediation are controlled and censored by direct force and or fear and intimidation, cultural debates cease to be in the service of the public. Thank you.
from the sublime to the ridiculous. So I'm, as you heard in the bio, an artist by training, and I work with technology. And I've always been interested in kind of the autonomous side of technology. And because computers were invented in the 19th century to calculate artillery trajectories, and when you're an art school student trying to work with kind of technology, you tend to deal in the surplus market. From the very beginning, my work's been influenced by and kind of in dialogue with military hardware and software and ideology. So this is Ronald Reagan telling us how to think about the Mujahideen back in the day when I was a teenager in the 1980s. And what's interesting, I mean, this is, I love starting with conspiracy theorists. That's, of course, Marilyn Monroe, who worked in one of the first commercial drone factories during World War II. And in fact, when Reagan was his job during World War II was being an official outreach coordinator as a captain in the Army for the U.S. Army, he was approached by the owner of this drone factory, Reginald Denny, who said, come, take photographs and promote the work that we're doing around these drones. That's Reginald Denny in the bottom left. And what was her name then? Betty Ray? Betty Jean? Norma Jean was working in the factory, and in fact that was her break, was being photographed by the Army assembling these airplanes. So the history is it's pretty complicated. I'll see if I can get to it at the end. I really started getting involved in this around unbelievably 22 years ago when Slovenia seceded from Yugoslavia, and I thought this was very strange because everyone knew there was going to be a war. Everyone knew that given the fresh history from World War II and World War I in Yugoslavia, the fact that it was a fabricated nation, the war would probably be really bad, but no one seemed to be able to do anything until the war broke out, at which point you could send NATO to kill some people, but I just thought it was very strange. And coming out of the Reagan era of the 1980s, where 50 cents on the US tax dollar was spent on the military, that we didn't really have a better solution. So I was, a 22-year-old art school student, and I decided to build this, which was a project called Hunter, which basically, and again, this was made out of military surplus. It was basically this assembly that had 3 microphones on it, and so if a loud sound came from somewhere, it could listen across the 3 microphones and time the subtle differences in the speed of sound, which is about 1,000 feet per second. 4,000 feet per second, and it would be able to reverse engineer where the sound had come from. And so then this was the intercity option, so it had a 9mm cannon, and it would fire back exactly in that direction. And so this is part of a series of designs I was doing called Designs for Dystopic Futures, and I finished it before the war in Yugoslavia broke out. The idea was that you could drop this and whoever fired the first shot would be shot back. Of course, I was kind of in dialogue with cruise missiles and the beginnings of what we now know as kind of robotic warfare. And I kept doing these projects that were sort of dystopia around automation. So I mean, this doesn't look like war, but this is an automatic DJ that I built, and this is from the BBC interview around it.
It's 3 in the morning at this impromptu rave, and the DJ's on fire. The reason he's so good is that he's a robot. His creator, Chris Csikszentmihalyi, that's his real name, explains why he invented it.
We're just trying to make human DJs obsolete as much as possible.
Why is that?
They're expensive, they're unreliable, they're all addicted to cocaine.
So my work was always this kind of rehearsal of the stupidest aspects of artificial intelligence, the kind of the weird replacement of humans by technologists. And so around 2000, I was recruited at the MIT Media Lab, which is, if you don't know, MIT is about 80% funded by the US government, and about 80% of that is the US military in one form or another. The largest single cost object outside of faculty's salaries is the Secret Weapons Lab. And so it was like a real question for me in 2000 whether I wanted to go, but I decided, you know, if I go and I give it hell, then it'll be worth it. I wasn't quite ready for, so it was hard, September 7th, 2001. So it was about 4 days before the campus kind of went into this really significant lockdown mode. It changed pretty dramatically. And the campus, you know, John Deutsch, former secretary of the CIA, was also the president of MIT. The ties are so strong that immediately I saw, I mean, like I literally had students who had books out from the library that FBI agents would come and request them to get the books back because they were relevant to something that was considered national security. So it was pretty close, and this is Rodney Brooks, one of the kind of heroes of artificial intelligence and robotics on the top left. And he runs the company iRobot, which makes those robot vacuum cleaners that you recognize from the bottom left, but also these militarized robots with guns on them and used for you know, getting rid of bombs and stuff. He was on, you know, my tenure vote, and right after 9/11, within a month or two, he was basically proposing to the Senate that he build robots to go to the caves of Tora Bora and find Bin Laden. And I thought to myself, that's really not probably going to work. I mean, yeah, call me crazy. And I was hanging out with this group of really fun artists from Spain who had come in October 2011. This is like some of their work around the G8 protests. And we were having drinks, and they were reminding me of Rambo 3. And I don't, how many of you have seen Rambo 3 recently? It's just unbelievable. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's that Reagan quote in, you know, 90 Minutes, an all-Israeli acting group. And it's such a train wreck of a film because literally you can transpose the word American for Russian in like every scene, and it still plays perfectly now. So we were, you know, I was just thinking about this like sudden media reversal around what the Mujahideen were, what the Taliban were, and you know how in the 1980s the U.S. media was portraying it completely in one way, and now it was being portrayed completely in another way. I remember like September 12th, I was, you know, watching cable TV as everyone else was, and I was like switching channels, and I was like, oh, this is awful. McCain, why is he on so much, every channel? And I finally got to this one channel where someone was saying something kind of smart, and I was like, what is this? And it was Canadian Broadcasting Company. And so with these Spanish artists, I just started sketching like, how could I find out through this kind of crazy American mediascape what's going on in Afghanistan? And of course, what do MIT professors do when they want to know about some environment that's too dangerous for them to go to themselves, right? They build robots to go. And so I started the idea of what if I could kind of send this, and I wasn't serious about it, what if I could send this, which after Wazhmah's talk, I feel really bad. What if I could, you know, basically disintermediate? And, you know, within a week after I sketched this, Rumsfeld was threatening U.S. journalists, saying that the U.S. Army would not help journalists who weren't embedded in Afghanistan. And, you know, the robot could talk to people about important issues, you know, make friends maybe across cultures. And so I get this call about 2 days after I'm in the bar, and I'm just starting to think about this project, and it's from a New York Times journalist named Matt Mirapol, who's an arts writer, and he wanted to do a story about the DJ, and I said, oh, well, you know, the DJ is an old project. There's something new that you know, you get the scoop on everyone else, and so I told him about this, and he was like, are you serious? And I was like, oh yeah, I'm completely serious. And he was like, is there a website? And I was like, well, it's not up yet, but yeah, we're gonna launch it. So like that night, I called like all my friends who can sketch, do Photoshop, whatever, and put together this website, which, you know, starts with a quote from Justice Black around the Pentagon Papers, and talks about the importance of kind of a free press, especially in war. And put together these like great information graphics that I knew the newspapers would love, including Afghanis, which of course is the currency. The interpreter kind of fading in the background. and a lot of things that were, you know, kind of trying to ride the knife's edge of like people realizing that I wasn't completely serious, but at the same time, you know, raising these issues. Just as background, you know, I went to undergrad and grad with the Yes Men, and then taught for 2 years at RPI. So I'd just come from like having the office next to Igor from the Yes Men. So knowing that it would take me a while to do something serious, but knowing that I had to do something, it seemed like a good kind of balance to strike. So I mean, I said things like, you know, that Afghanistan's easier than Mars, although they're both largely red. And so the New York Times ended up writing the article in November 2001, and this wasn't a big period of dissent. I mean, I don't know how many of you guys were actively like saying that going to war in Afghanistan would be a bad idea or whatever. You know, it was a pretty, you know, and of course at MIT it drew a lot of kind of crazy attention. The peace symbol was really important because, of course, it's universal, right? So this was kind of version 1.0. You know, you know, it never really worked that well. None of my things do. And then around February, I think it was, the U.S. Army released America's Army. It was like a video game kind of skin of, I think, Half-Life, which was basically training young kids on video games and kind of the contemporary weapon systems and things like that. So one of my students was like, oh great, I can skin the video game so that they'll also be prepared to work alongside the Afghan explorer as they're fighting. And then, you know, there was this kind of lull in the media for a while. And then I love this Donald Rumsfeld quote about the first Predator drone strike. A decision was made to fire the Hellfire missile. It was fired. And so this was 2002. And right after that, there's this whole other wave of kind of media attention around the project because, in fact, I had talked a lot about this kind of interesting fallacy the journalists were making, which was that it would be impossible to have a robot journalist because, of course, journalists have to be sensitive to local conditions. They have to learn local knowledge. They have to understand the political nuances of a situation. And so, you know, it was kind of remarkable to me that journalist after journalist, like this from the BBC, you know, would quote a journalist saying the job of a human journalist cannot be replaced. They can offer empathy and sympathy where a robot cannot. The crucial thing is how you interpret facts and pictures. Central to reporting is the sense of being there. And yet they would have articles about drones and not bring up those issues in the same way. And so this became sort of this media judo that I would do going back and forth pretty consistently, trying to highlight the relationship between this clearly stupid idea of a robot reporter and this like even far more stupid idea of robot soldiers. And with some success. I mean, you know, I was getting enough interviews around this time. I was live on CNN at one point, and, you know, I had made it my goal that night to use the word robotic killing machines as often as I could in the interview, and I hit 8 before they finally went to commercial. So you know, it was all of 2002 was basically a year spent trying to highlight this kind of growing reliance on drones and what an incredibly dumb idea it was. The great news at MIT was that, you know, all of this was like happening in real time around me because so many of the technologies were from there. You know, Missy Cummings was junior faculty around the same time as I am, and any PBS show you've ever seen about drones interviews her. And, you know, so we were kind of in dialogue as well with the MIT campus. At that point, you know, someone in Rodney Brooks' research group sent one of my students an email that Rodney had sent saying what an asshole I was, how I was like damaging MIT's credibility and stuff like that. And, you know, we had all these sponsors at the Media Lab, which was, we had sponsors from the NSA, we had sponsors from the DoD, we had sponsors from United Technologies, which makes the air conditioners that are probably on top of this building, but they also are heavily involved in the Predator program. And so in late 2002, 2003, one of the representatives from United Technologies came during one of our sponsor open houses and, you know, said, oh, wow, interesting. I worked on the Predator program, you know, from the 1990s on. And I said, wow, that's amazing. I mean, you know, something I was always curious about, you guys seem to be able to retrofit it with